Welcome to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring the random prompts of Daniel Rosehill as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters. Join us for deep dives into AI, technology, and whatever other random thing Daniel finds fascinating today. Subscribe on Spotify or your favorite podcatcher. Now, today's episode.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hey Herman and Corin. So I want to kick off a couple of episodes about privacy and digital privacy, which I'm afraid was one of the topics that apparently was lost in the great episode purge when we got rid of those old episodes from the first pipeline that didn't have my mellifluous voice in the prompt, and we had those very grating jarry TTS voices. So some episodes were scrubbed in the interest of keeping a unified show format and a certain quality standard. And I'm afraid some of our discussions about digital privacy were scrapped, but maybe it's for the better. We've had a few more months to dwell and to get to know one another digitally. And there's a few key issues that I'd love to talk about. The first is tracking pixels. So these are one of those things that I actually have quite a strong opinion about, that these should really not be legal. Tracking pixels, are talking about invisible pixels that get embedded into emails, and they can't be seen, but they are accessed from the recipient's computer, and they'll provide the sender with not just whether the email was opened, but a whole bunch of parameters ranging from what type of computer they're using to what type of screen resolution to where they were, potentially through to everything that can be used to build up a digital fingerprint. And I find that concept very creepy. It comes into, there's a bit of a conflict that can happen when one sometimes find themselves working, and I'm not saying this is my current situation, but certainly in the past, you work for a company that wants to use this in their marketing, or they're using a tool that just bakes this in without question, and they want to gather that analytics, and your personal convictions say, I don't want to use email pixel tracking at all. I think it's invasive, but sometimes one doesn't have the luxury of being able to call those kind of shots. But I'm curious to know what kind of, how the privacy discussion around these has been, because it always strikes me as funny that we spend so much time and effort thinking about things like the GDPR, where we're often just taking companies that were governing data fairly well, forcing them to appoint a data protection officer to give this illusion of an incredible amount of respect for users' data, and then we don't blink when those same companies send out an email campaign with pixel tracking. I think that's very strange. This is a very direct way of gaining a lot of information about us, and it's great if they can delete our data from that they didn't really need to be holding according to GDPR, and you can contact a data protection officer if you have a rainy day afternoon. But realistically, I imagine the companies bank on the fact that almost no one's going to do that, and they can just carry on with getting this information. So there's a bunch of tools for those who do find the idea of tracking pixels disturbing. There is thankfully some good tools for taking back or blocking these. Now, the ones I'm familiar with, we have AdSense running on our local network. This is a network level tool, and there's ones that can be installed on the device for those who don't manage the network they're connecting to, or just don't want the complication. But the challenge with these tools always becomes that if you cast the net too wide, you can end up breaking features in apps like Google. But it is interesting that this exists. There's certainly a large number of users who want it. But I'm interested to know what kind of pushback, if any, there has been against this, because I think that instead of asking consumers to spin up this tooling on their own networks, which is going to be a big ask for a lot of people, and even for more technically savvy users can be a real pain to maintain. I think a better line of attack for those of us who believe that this is a real breach of digital privacy is to begin questioning the legitimacy of this practice in the first place. And we're talking about CRMs everyone who is enabling millions of companies to use this. I think it's really worth thinking, hey, is this a legitimate form? It's very strange that we just have normalized this kind of data capture. And we talk about everything else from digital fingerprinting. But what about the humble tracking pixel? Herman and Corin, let's talk about that in today's episode of My Weird Prompts.
Welcome back to My Weird Prompts. I am Korn, and I am joined as always by my brother, the man who has probably read more privacy policies this morning than most people read in a lifetime.
Herman Poppleberry here, and you were not wrong about that, Korn, although, to be fair, I was mostly looking for the opt-out clauses, which are getting harder and harder to find these days. It is February 22nd, 2026, and you would think that after years of privacy regulations, things would be getting simpler for the average user. But instead, it feels like we are just playing a high-stakes game of hide-and-seek with our own data.
It really is a full-time job just trying to stay invisible online. It feels like every time we close one door, the industry finds a window or a floorboard to crawl through. And that actually leads us perfectly into today's prompt from a listener named Daniel. He wants to talk about something that is designed to be completely invisible, yet it is everywhere in our digital lives. We are talking about tracking pixels.
Oh, this is a big one. This is one of those foundational technologies that has just sort of faded into the background of the internet, but it has massive, massive implications for how we are monitored, profiled, and ultimately sold to. Daniel is specifically looking at tracking pixels in emails. These are those tiny one-by-one images that tell a sender exactly when, where, and how you open their message.
Right, and Daniel feels quite strongly that this should not even be legal. He is questioning why we have all these big heavy-duty regulations, like the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe, or the various state laws in the US, yet we still normalize this direct, silent data capture. It is an interesting point. We have moved toward cookie banners on every single website, which are annoying but at least visible. But our inboxes are still a bit of a Wild West.
It really is. And the thing about tracking pixels is that they are so much more insidious than cookies in some ways. With a cookie, your browser has some level of agency. You can clear them, you can block third-party cookies, you can use incognito mode. But a tracking pixel is just a request for an image. It is baked into the very way HTML email works. It exploits the basic functionality of the web to turn your inbox into a surveillance tool.
So, let us start with the basics for a second, Herman, for anyone who has heard the term but does not quite get the mechanics. When we say a tracking pixel is a one-by-one image, what does that actually look like in practice? Because I think most people assume it is just a bit of invisible code, but it is literally a graphic file, right?
Exactly. It is a tiny, transparent image file, usually a GIF or a PNG. It is only 1 pixel wide and 1 pixel tall, so even if it were not transparent, you would never see it with the naked eye on a modern high-resolution screen. It is embedded in the HTML of the email using a standard image tag. When you open that email, your email client, whether that is Outlook or Gmail or Apple Mail, sees that image tag and says, okay, I need to fetch this image from the remote server so I can display the full message.
And that is the trigger. The moment your computer asks the remote server for that tiny, tiny image, the server knows you have opened the email. It is like a silent ping back to the mothership.
Exactly. And because that request has to come from your specific device, it carries a massive amount of baggage with it. It is not just a, hey, I opened this notification. The HTTP request includes your IP address, which gives a pretty good idea of your general location, sometimes down to the neighborhood or even the specific office building. It tells them the exact millisecond you opened it. It includes your user agent string, which reveals your operating system, your browser type, your device model, and sometimes even your screen resolution and battery level.
And because the sender can give each recipient a unique URL for that pixel, they know exactly which person is opening which email. It is not just anonymous data about someone opening the mail. It is tied directly to your email address and your identity in their database.
That is the part that gets really creepy and where the digital fingerprinting Daniel mentioned comes into play. In a marketing context, this is how companies build these incredibly detailed profiles. They know you opened the sales email at 10 p.m. on a Sunday from your phone while you were at a specific hotel in London. Then they know you opened it again at 9 a.m. on Monday from your laptop at your office in New York. They are building a map of your habits, your travel, and your work schedule without you ever clicking a single link or replying to a single message.
It is funny you mention the office, because I remember reading that some high-end sales tools even track how many times an email is forwarded. If the pixel gets pinged from 5 different IP addresses in the same hour, the salesperson knows their proposal is being passed around the company. It gives them this weird asymmetrical information advantage. They know the internal temperature of a deal before they even hop on a follow-up call.
It is a huge advantage, and Daniel's point about normalization is so spot on. If someone followed you around a physical store and took notes on every time you picked up an item and looked at it, even if you did not buy it, you would find that incredibly invasive. You would probably call security. But in the digital space, we have just accepted that this is how email marketing works. We have been conditioned to think that open rates are just a standard business metric, but we rarely stop to think about the privacy violation required to generate that metric.
Well, let us talk about that normalization. Why do you think it has stayed under the radar for so long compared to something like web cookies? Is it just because it is invisible, or is there something else at play?
I think it is a combination of things. First, as you said, it is invisible. You cannot see a pixel, you can see a cookie banner. Second, for a long time, we viewed image loading as a core feature. We want our emails to look nice. We want the brand logos, the product photos, the fancy formatting. The tracking pixel just piggybacks on that desire for a rich visual experience. It hides in plain sight.
It also feels like there is a bit of a technical hurdle for the average person. Daniel mentioned that there are tools to block these, but they can be a pain to maintain. I know you have played around with network-level blocking at home. How does that actually work, and why is it so difficult for a normal person to set up?
Yeah, I use a few different layers. One is a PI hole, which is a network-wide ad blocker that runs on a small computer like a Raspberry Pi. It basically acts as a DNS server for the whole house. When an app or an email client tries to reach out to a known tracking domain, the PI hole just says, "Sorry, that address does not exist." It drops the request before it ever leaves the house.
But as Daniel pointed out, that can break things, right?
Oh, it definitely can. And this is the cat and mouse game he was talking about. Sometimes a company will host their tracking pixels on the same domain they use for their actual images or even their login services. If you block the tracker, you might block the whole email from rendering properly. Or you might find that you cannot click on certain links because they are also being routed through a tracking redirect that your filter has flagged. It becomes this constant game of tweaking your block lists. Most people just do not have the time, the inclination, or the technical knowledge for that. It turns privacy into a hobby, which it really should not be.
Right. And that brings us to the core of Daniel's argument. Should the burden really be on us? If this is a fundamental breach of privacy, why are we expected to be amateur network engineers just to stop it? Why aren't the CRMs, the customer relationship management systems, being held accountable for making this the default?
This is where the legal and ethical discussion gets really interesting, especially as we look at the landscape in 2026. From a marketing perspective, the argument has always been that this is legitimate interest. They claim they want to know if their campaigns are effective so they can send more relevant content and not spam people who are not interested. They see it as a tool for better service.
But that feels like a bit of a reach, doesn't it? I mean, I can see wanting to know if a campaign is working in the aggregate. Like, out of 10,000 people, how many open the email? But do they really need to know that Korn opened it at midnight on his iPad from a specific IP address?
Exactly. There is a massive, massive difference between aggregate analytics and individual surveillance. And that is where the pushback has started to happen. You mentioned earlier the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR. Under that framework, and the newer e-privacy regulation updates we have seen in the last couple of years, there is a very strong argument that tracking pixels require explicit opt-in consent. But because it is so deeply embedded in the infrastructure of the internet, enforcement has been incredibly slow. Regulators are often playing catch-up with technologies that were standardized 20 years ago.
However, we have seen some big tech companies step in where the regulators have been slow to act. I am thinking specifically about Apple. Their mail privacy protection was a huge deal when it launched a few years ago. How has that changed the landscape now that we are 5 years into that reality?
It was a massive shot across the bow for the marketing industry. For those who do not know, Apple Mail Privacy Protection, or MPP, basically routes all email images through a proxy server. When an email arrives in your inbox, Apple servers automatically download all the images, including the tracking pixels, regardless of whether you have opened the email or not.
So, from the sender's perspective, it looks like every single person using Apple Mail opened the email the second it arrived.
Precisely. It makes the data useless. It masks your IP address, it masks your actual open time, and it makes it impossible to tell if the human actually saw the message. It was a huge aha moment for the industry. Suddenly, these metrics that marketers had relied on for decades were just gone for a huge chunk of their audience. And since Apple has such a large market share in the US and Europe, it forced a lot of companies to rethink their entire strategy.
I remember the fallout from that. Marketers were panicking. They were saying it was the end of personalized email, that the email apocalypse was here. But here we are in 2026, and we're still getting emails. It did not break the internet.
No, it just forced them to find other ways to measure engagement. But it also highlighted the central problem Daniel is talking about. Apple can do that because they control the hardware and the software. They have the resources to run massive proxy servers. But what about people on Android, or people using webmail like Gmail or Outlook? They are still being tracked by default unless they go deep into their settings and manually turn off image loading.
And let's be honest, turning off image loading makes for a pretty terrible email experience. You're just looking at a bunch of grey boxes and alt text. It feels like you've gone back to the early 90s. It is not a real solution for most people.
It really isn't, and that is the trade-off they count on. They know most people will choose the convenience and the aesthetics over the privacy. It is that classic privacy paradox. We say we care about privacy, but we are rarely willing to sacrifice user experience for it, and the industry knows this. They design the systems to make privacy the inconvenient choice.
So let us look at the CRMs Daniel specifically mentioned them. Companies like MailChimp, HubSpot, Salesforce, Klaviyo. These are the platforms that provide the tracking pixels as a standard, often mandatory feature. If you're a small business owner and you sign up for one of these services, the tracking is turned on by default. You don't even have to think about it. In fact, you often can't even turn it off easily.
It is baked into the product. In fact, it is often sold as a core value proposition. Track your open rates, see who is clicking. Optimize your send times. These platforms have built entire multi-billion-dollar business models around the collection and analysis of this data. If they were forced to disable tracking pixels by default, their product would suddenly look a lot less powerful to their customers, even if it were more ethical.
But is that a legitimate business model if it relies on silent surveillance? I mean, if we compare it to other industries, it starts to look pretty shaky. Imagine if a phone company recorded every time you picked up your phone to check the time, even if you didn't make a call, and sold that data to telemarketers so they knew when you were most likely to be near your phone. People would be outraged.
It is a great analogy, and I think we are finally starting to see a shift in the legal landscape as we move through 2026. There have been some very interesting cases in Europe lately. For example, the Dutch Data Protection Authority has been very critical of tracking pixels. There was a case involving a major media company that was using pixels in their newsletters without proper consent. The regulators basically said, look, if you are collecting personal data like IP addresses and behavior, you need to ask first. Period. No legitimate interest. Excuses.
But how do you ask for consent for a pixel that is invisible? Do you put a banner at the top of every email? By reading this email, you consent to being tracked? That sounds like it would kill email marketing overnight. No one would click yes to that.
It might, or it might force a move toward more ethical, privacy-preserving analytics. There are companies out there now, and we've seen more of them pop up in the last year trying to do privacy-first email analytics. They use things like hashed IP addresses or aggregate data that cannot be traced back to an individual. They give the marketer the big picture without spying on the individual. But they are still the exception, not the rule, because the big CRMs have no incentive to change their cash cow.
I think one of the most interesting parts of Daniel's prompt is the idea of questioning the legitimacy of the practice itself. Instead of finding ways to block it, should we just be saying, this is not okay? Is there a world where tracking pixels are just banned? Like outright illegal?
It is a bold thought, but it is one that is gaining traction. If you think about it, a tracking pixel is essentially a form of unauthorized access to your device. It is making your computer perform a technical task, which is fetching an image from a specific server, for the sole purpose of reporting back on your behavior without your knowledge or meaningful consent. If that were a piece of software you installed, we would call it spyware.
That is a strong word, Herman. Spyware. But when you break it down like that, it is hard to argue with. It is code running on your machine, reporting your actions to a third party without a clear user interface or an easy way to opt out.
Exactly. And the only reason it has escaped the spyware label for 20 years is because it is wrapped in the harmless cloak of a standard HTML image tag, but the function is the same. I think there is a growing movement of privacy advocates who are pushing for this to be reclassified. They want to see it treated the same way as other forms of digital fingerprinting, which are increasingly being restricted by browsers like Firefox and Brave.
Let's talk about that fingerprinting aspect. Daniel mentioned that these pixels are used to build a digital fingerprint. Can you explain how that works for someone who isn't a techie? How does a tiny image lead to a full profile that follows you around the web?
Sure. So, it is not just about the one pixel in one email. It is about the combination of all the data that the request carries. Your IP address gives your location. Your user agent string tells them your browser, your version, your operating system. Your screen resolution tells them what kind of device you have. Your language settings tell them where you're from. When you combine all these data points, you get a unique signature. Even if you clear your cookies, your fingerprint often stays the same because your hardware and software configuration is unique to you.
So if I open an email from Company A, they get my fingerprint. Then, if I visit Company B's website, and they use the same tracking service or the same ad network, they can recognize me by my fingerprint even if I've never been to their site before and I've blocked all their cookies.
Exactly. They can link your email activity to your web browsing activity. They can see that the person who opened the running shoes email is the same person who just spent 20 minutes looking at marathon training plans on a different site. It allows for cross-site, cross-platform tracking that is incredibly difficult to escape. It turns the entire internet into one giant interconnected surveillance net.
This is why I think Daniel is so frustrated. It feels like no matter what we do as individuals, the system is rigged against us. We can block cookies, we can use VPNs, we can use private browsers, but the moment we open a simple email, we're vulnerable again. It feels like a betrayal of a very basic form of communication.
It is a weak point in our digital armor, and it is a weak point that is being exploited by thousands of companies every single day. I think the pushback Daniel is looking for is starting to happen, but it is coming from a few different directions. You have the tech giants like Apple and DuckDuckGo. You have the regulators in Europe. And you have a small but vocal group of developers who are building tools to strip trackers out of HTML before they even reach your inbox.
I've seen some of those tools. There's an extension called Ugly Email for Gmail that puts a little eye icon next to any email that contains a tracking pixel. It's a great way to at least see who's watching you. It is a bit of a wake-up call when you see that eye icon on almost every single message in your promotions tab.
I love that name, Ugly Email. It really highlights how distasteful the practice is. But again, as Daniel said, it's a browser extension. It only works if you use Gmail in a desktop browser. If you used a mobile app, or if you use a different client, you're back to square one. The burden is still on the user to find, install, and maintain these tools.
So, Herman, if you were in charge, if you were the internet czar for a day, what would the solution look like? Would you ban tracking pixels entirely? Or is there a middle ground that respects both privacy and the needs of legitimate businesses?
I think the middle ground is privacy by design. I would love to see a world where the email protocols themselves are updated. Right now, email is based on SMTP and other standards that are decades old. When those standards were written, nobody was thinking about digital fingerprinting or mass surveillance. What if the email protocol itself stripped out tracking parameters from image URLs? Or what if it required a specific header for any tracking-related requests that the client could then easily and automatically block?
That sounds like a massive undertaking. Getting the whole internet to agree on a new email standard is like trying to turn an aircraft carrier with a wooden paddle.
It is, but we've done it before. We moved from HTTP to HTTPS for security. It took time, it took a lot of pushing from companies like Google and Mozilla, but it happened because the benefits were so clear. I think we need a similar shift for privacy. But in the short term, I think Daniel is right. We need to stop placing the burden on the consumer. We need to start holding the platforms, the CRMs, accountable.
So, instead of me having to install a PI hole or a browser extension, a company like MailChimp should have to prove that they have explicit, informed consent from me before they are allowed to fire that pixel.
Exactly. And if they can't prove it, they shouldn't be allowed to offer the feature. It should be an opt-in for the recipient, not an opt-out for the sender. Imagine if every time you signed up for a newsletter, there was a mandatory unbundled checkbox. Do you want us to track exactly when, where, and on what device you open this email? Most people would say no. And that's exactly why the industry doesn't want to ask. Their entire value proposition relies on our ignorance.
It really comes down to that, doesn't it? The entire model relies on the fact that most people don't know it's happening. If we were fully aware of the level of detail being captured, we would almost certainly reject it. It is a lack of transparency that borders on deception.
It is. And transparency is the foundation of trust. By using these invisible pixels, companies are essentially saying, we don't trust you to give us this data voluntarily, so we're going to take it secretly. That is a terrible way to start or maintain a relationship with a customer. It is the opposite of customer centricity, which is a word these companies love to throw around.
It's interesting. I was looking into the history of this, and the first tracking pixels were actually used for a very different purpose back in the late 90s. They were used to verify that an ad had actually been displayed on a page. It was a way to prevent fraud in the early days of web advertising. It was a technical solution to a technical problem.
That is often how these things start. A legitimate technical need for verification gets warped over time into a tool for mass surveillance. It is a classic case of function creep. We saw the same thing with GPS on phones. It was originally for emergency services and navigation, and now it's used to track your every move so you can be served localized ads for a coffee shop you're walking past. The technology stays the same, but the intent becomes more and more invasive.
It feels like we're constantly fighting this battle where technology outpaces our ability to govern it. By the time we realize a tool is being used for something invasive, it's already become an industry standard with billions of dollars behind it. It is hard to put the genie back in the bottle.
And that is why Daniel's prompt is so timely, even in 2026. We are at a crossroads. As we move into an era of more advanced artificial intelligence and even more granular data collection, we have to decide what our baseline for privacy is. Is an email a private communication between two parties, or is it a data gathering opportunity for a third-party platform?
I think most people would say it's the former. When I send you an email, Herman, I expect it to be a conversation between us. I don't expect a dozen different tracking servers in 3 different countries to be notified the moment you read it.
Exactly. And yet, that is the reality for almost every email we send and receive today. Even personal emails can be tracked if you're using certain browser extensions or plugins that help you manage your inbox. It's everywhere. It has become the background radiation of the internet.
So, let's talk about some practical takeaways for our listeners. Because while we want the big systemic changes Daniel is talking about, people still have to live in the world as it exists today. What can someone do right now, this afternoon, if they're feeling creeped out by this?
The simplest and most effective thing you can do is to disable automatic image loading in your email client. Every major app has a setting for this. In Gmail, it's under Images in the General Settings. You can set it to Ask before displaying external images. In Apple Mail, if you aren't using their privacy protection, it's under Preferences, then Viewing.
Right, and as we said, it makes the emails look a bit boring, but it puts the power back in your hands. You get to decide when a sender gets that open notification. You are essentially manualizing the privacy process.
Exactly. You can choose to load the images for a newsletter you trust and keep them blocked for the random cold emails from salespeople or companies you don't know. It's a bit of a manual process, but it's the best defense we have right now that doesn't require a degree in computer science.
What about those privacy-first email providers? I've heard people talking about things like Proton Mail or Tuta. Do they handle this differently?
They do. Many of them have built-in protection against tracking pixels. Proton Mail, for example, proxies all images by default, similar to what Apple does, but they also have a feature that explicitly identifies and blocks known tracking pixels while letting the real images through. If you're really serious about email privacy, moving to a dedicated privacy-focused provider is a huge step up from the big free services that rely on data mining.
And for the more technically inclined, like yourself, there are tools like DuckDuckGo's email protection. I've been using that lately. It gives you a duck.com address that strips out trackers before forwarding the email to your real inbox.
I've heard good things about that. It's a clever way to add a layer of protection without having to switch your entire email ecosystem. It's basically a middleman that cleans your mail before you see it. It is like having a digital butler who checks your mail for bugs before handing it to you.
It's actually been really eye-opening. Every time I get an email through it, I can see a report of how many trackers were removed. Some emails from major retailers have 5 or 6 different pixels in them. It's wild to see it laid out like that. It makes you realize how much effort they are putting into watching you.
It's that aha moment again. Once you see the scale of the tracking, you can't unsee it. It changes your entire relationship with your inbox. You start to see every email as a potential probe.
But let's go back to Daniel's bigger question. Should we be questioning the legitimacy of the CRMIS? If we want to see real change, where does the pressure need to be applied? Is it the regulators, or is it the companies themselves?
I think it has to be both. We need regulators to step up and clarify that tracking pixels are personal data and require explicit, unambiguous consent under laws like GDPR and California's Consumer Privacy Act. We need some high-profile fines to make the CRMIS take notice. But we also need a cultural shift. We need businesses to realize that tracking their customers without their knowledge is a bad look. It is a violation of the brand promise.
It's a branding issue. If a company claims to value your privacy, but their emails are full of hidden trackers, that's a massive contradiction. It's privacy washing.
Exactly. I love that term. Privacy washing. It's like greenwashing, but for data. We need to start calling it out. When you see a company using these tactics, let them know you don't appreciate it. Send a support ticket. Tweet at them. If enough customers complain, the CRMIS will eventually be forced to change their defaults because their customers, the marketers, will be asking for more ethical tools.
It reminds me of the pushback against third-party cookies. For years, the industry said they were essential for the internet to function. They said the free web would die without them. Then, after enough pressure from users, regulators, and companies like Apple and Mozilla, the big browsers started phasing them out. Now, in 2026, we're living in a post-cookie world. It's not perfect, but it's a huge improvement.
It shows that change is possible. The status quo is never set in stone. It's just the current set of compromises we've agreed to. And I think we're ready for a new set of compromises when it comes to email. We are ready for an inbox that isn't a two-way mirror.
I hope so, because the current situation is just not sustainable. We can't keep pretending that this level of silent surveillance is normal or okay. It's a breach of trust, plain and simple. And as Daniel said, the burden shouldn't be on us to fix it.
Well said, Corn, and I think Daniel would agree. It's about taking back our digital space. Our inboxes should be a private sanctuary, a place for communication, not a data mining operation for a CRM in a different time zone.
Absolutely. This has been a fascinating deep dive. I think it's one of those topics where the more you learn, the more you realize how much is happening beneath the surface of even the simplest digital actions. It's not just about a tiny pixel. It's about the entire philosophy of the modern web and who it is designed to serve.
It really is, and I'm glad Daniel prompted us to talk about it. It's an issue that affects every single one of us every time we hit refresh on our mail app. It is a conversation that is long overdue.
Well, if you've been listening and you're now rushing to your settings to turn off image loading, we've done our job. And hey, if you're enjoying the show and finding these discussions helpful, we'd really appreciate a quick review on your podcast app. It genuinely helps other people find us and join the conversation. We are trying to build a community of people who care about these weird but important prompts.
It really does. We love seeing those reviews come in. And if you have your own thoughts on tracking pixels, or if you found a great tool for blocking them that we didn't mention, we'd love to hear from you. We are all in this together.
You can reach us at show@myweirdprompts.com, We're always looking for new angles and listener perspectives. And of course, you can find all our past episodes and more information at our website, myweirdprompts.com.
We're available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and pretty much anywhere you listen to your favorite shows.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of My Weird Prompts. I'm Corn.
And I'm Herman Poppleberry.
We'll see you next time.
Goodbye, everyone. Stay safe out there.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring Daniel Rosehill's AI prompts, as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters including me, Cornelius the Sloth. Subscribe on Spotify or visit myweirdprompts.com.